A black woman in a suit, walking like a CO. One look and I know that ticket's fake. The white cop sneered as she approached the first-class gate at the airport. He didn't scan her code. He didn't need a reason. Her skin color and the way she carried herself were enough for a man drunk on authority to switch into full-blown humiliation mode. He snatched her ticket, cuffed her in front of the entire flight crew, satisfied as if he had just unmasked a fraud. But he didn't know he had picked the wrong target. This time, the woman he degraded was none other than the federal advisor overseeing the national defense budget and global relief funds. And his ignorance, not just his cruelty, would be what ended him. Where you live, does arrogance come with a uniform? Boarding gate 12, 7:30 a.m. The waiting area had begun to empty as the third and final boarding call echoed through the ceiling speakers, repeated in a flat, automated female voice. Flight 6731 to Washington, D.C., final call for boarding. Please proceed to gate 12. A line of passengers moved in rhythm, scanning tickets one by one, neatly packed luggage in tow, their gazes vacant, dulled by routine. No one spoke loudly. No one broke form. Just the synchronized quiet of a society functioning as programmed, until she appeared. Celeste Ruth Coleman, 62 years old, black, her salt and pepper hair neatly pinned at the nape, wearing a buttoned black suit and plain low-heeled shoes with no visible brand. In her left hand was a dark leather laptop bag. In her right, a phone balanced between thumb and forefinger, a posture neither arrogant nor deferential. She approached the front of the line and raised the QR code on her screen to the scanner. The green light blinked. The familiar beep sounded. Done. The system approved. But she could not proceed. An arm extended across her path, slow but firm, like an automated gate in a system coded with prejudice. "Hold on," came a male voice, not loud but sharp enough to sever the air. Rick Hardwell, airport security officer, over 6 feet tall, high and tight haircut, black gloves on his hands, radio hissing faintly on his shoulder. He stared at her with unfiltered suspicion. "Let me see that ticket again." Celeste calmly extended her phone. He didn't glance at the screen. He reached out, snatched the temporary paper printout tucked behind it, and squinted at it. "Too bright. Not a fake ticket, I hope?" His voice dripped with sarcasm, as if each boarding pass came printed in a different skin tone. A white family, parents with 2 children, stood directly behind her. The mother saw everything but stayed silent. The father nudged his children forward. Rick glanced their way, then turned back to Celeste. They seemed to know how to behave. No cutting the line, no hiding codes, no attitude. His eyes swept across her laptop bag, handcrafted leather, modest in cost but precise in stitching. No logos, nothing loud, just discipline and design. But to Rick, that was suspicious, too meticulous, too quiet, too unlike the type he was used to interrogating. The crowd's gaze began to shift toward them. Not because of noise, but because something felt off. A man across the aisle adjusted his backpack, but didn't turn away. A young woman lifted her phone to chest level, pretending to text, camera still rolling. An older passenger took a step back, as though sensing an omen. Not the fearful kind, but the kind that makes you ashamed on someone else's behalf. Celeste didn't flinch. She looked at Rick, unbothered, unsmiling, unprovocative. She asked, her tone even, her voice soft and devoid of emotion, "Is there a system error?" The question landed like a quiet slap, so calm it cut deeper. Rick paused half a beat, raised an eyebrow, smirked. "Maybe. Or maybe the error's in you." He emphasized you, not as a crime without trial, just the presumption. You don't belong here. She stayed rooted. Her eyes didn't shift. No panic, no defiance, no appeal to the crowd, just a still figure amidst a cracking system, where every minor detail could become an unspoken indictment. The ticket had been canned. The information was valid. But she was not allowed through, because here correct didn't mean permitted, and polite didn't shield a black woman from a gaze that had already decided she was incorrect. Rick maintained his smug posture like a man running a game whose rules he alone could write. He nodded to a colleague standing nearby, a subtle signal, nothing loud, just a look, because in places like this, a glance could be a command, if it came from the right skin, in the right uniform, wearing the right gloves. Over the PA system, the automated voice repeated, "Final call for boarding, Flight 6731, Gate 12. But no one moved forward. Passengers behind stood still. Some turned away, some froze. A middle-aged woman gripped her young son's hand and whispered something. The boy looked at Celeste, then at Rick, his eyes wide, as though witnessing his first lesson in a kind of power that doesn't appear in textbooks. Celeste glanced up at the large screen displaying the flight schedule. Still on time, but her time had been delayed by a man who believed he had the right to do so. She rotated her wrist slightly, a habitual motion, not from impatience, but control, because a woman who'd once stood in international briefings, who'd conversed with defense ministers, would not let a front-line officer rattle her pulse. Rick didn't hand back the ticket. He held it, fingers curled, thumb scratching at the bold print as if searching for a misprint. His behavior didn't cross legal lines. No yelling, no pushing, no violence, just a deliberate slowness, enough to make someone feel they were no longer standing on equal ground. Then he spoke, softly, deliberately, a sound sharp enough to fracture the still air like glass. "Last time I let someone like you board without a full check, I had to file a 3-page report. I'm not doing that again." The sentence offered no justification. It offered an assumption, as if Celeste wore the face of every person who'd ever made him feel paperwork, feel powerless, feel unseen. And that's why he stopped her. Not because of the ticket, not because of the suit, not because of the bag, but because of something more invisible. The sense that someone like her shouldn't board a plane without his approval. Simple as that. Behind him, the words "final call" began to blink on the screen. But before Celeste stood only a man blocking her way, not with weapons, not with barriers, but with the misplaced belief that his skin color and authority were the final wall of order. An order that had long since rotted, and she simply stood. She did not step back, she did not beg, she did not yield. And that, in Rick's eyes, was the greatest threat of the morning. Not a bomb, not a suspicious laptop, not an unclaimed bag, but the silence of someone unafraid to be detained, because she knew it was men like him who were truly held captive by the prison of their thoughts, and she, having lived through all she had, didn't need to say a word to prove it. She only needed to stand. That moment lasted no more than 10 seconds, but in Rick's mind, the silence lodged like a thorn in the ego he had built from fleeting authority and a sneering disposition. He hated the way she stood, the way she looked at him, and especially the way she had no intention of yielding. A black woman, unafraid, unapologetic, not flustered into explaining herself, standing so upright that it made him feel threatened, not by force, but by the presence of a dignity beyond his grasp. Rick flexed his wrist, the rubber of his gloves letting out a faint squeak, then stepped forward, fully blocking Celeste's path. He didn't need to raise his voice. His steel-edged tone cut through the air enough. "Face the wall. Hands behind your back. No explanation, no warning, no legal protocol invoked. Just a blunt, dry command, heavy with dominance, like a foreman issuing orders to faulty cargo." Celeste didn't protest or lift her chin. She merely tilted her head slightly, as if listening to a misaligned breath from the man before her, then gave a faint nod, not to obey, but to affirm that she understood exactly who he was. She slowly turned, facing the pale wall, hands moving behind her back as instructed. There was no submission in the motion. It resembled a controlled maneuver, as if she were demonstrating to a trainee how to perform the procedure properly. Rick approached, unclipped the handcuffs from his belt, snapped them open with a mechanical click, and without a word of consent, swiftly and coldly clamped them onto her wrists. No pause, no courtesy. Then, as if to justify his abuse of power, he spoke in a steady tone, flat but sharp as a slap. "I've seen all kinds pretending to be decent, especially the ones who rehearse sorry for the inconvenience." It wasn't a warning. It was a conviction. He didn't care who she was, where she was headed, or whether she'd done anything wrong. All he needed was to feel right, and that feeling cobbled together from warped experience and petty power, became the only justification he needed to tighten metal around the wrists of a woman he didn't understand and didn't plan to. Celeste didn't resist, didn't turn back, didn't speak a word. Her shoulders remained steady. Only her eyes dropped slightly to look at her shoes, black, clean, low-heeled, silent, as if her thoughts had already moved on to where she was meant to go, to the steps she would no longer take, rather than the man who had deliberately humiliated her. Those shoes had walked through countless international summits, down government corridors, into meetings where every word was measured, and now they stood motionless in an airport hallway, while a man who understood nothing of dignity believed that handcuffs were the only language capable of keeping the world in order. Nearby, a young female airport employee, likely in her late 20s, still holding her radio, stood frozen. Her eyes are wide, her lips slightly parted as though she wanted to speak but couldn't. She looked at the scene unfolding before her as if witnessing the collapse of a moral code that the system had long tried to mask with its rehearsed anti-bias training. Then, almost involuntarily, she raised her hand, pressed the internal radio button, and whispered, "Wrongdoing." Her voice was unclear. Was it fear? Was it sorrow? Or was it the sting of betraying something long dead within this institution? 3 meters away, a little girl about 8 stood with her mother. Blonde pigtails holding a stuffed animal, her clear eyes locked on Celeste's cuffed hands, unblinking, unmoving. She turned to her mother, tugged her arm, and asked softly, "Why did they handcuff her? She dresses like Grandma." The question rang like a cracked bell, striking the hearts of those still trying to pretend that everything was by the book. The mother froze, unsure how to respond. Her gaze drifted elsewhere, her hand gripping her daughter's tightly. And in that moment, the child understood. Some wrongs can't be explained by law, only by the silence of adults. And that was when the truth revealed itself. Rick didn't need a reason to handcuff Celeste. He just needed a window, and this system, with its loopholes, its vague protocols, its complicit silences, gave him that window. He didn't shout, he didn't strike, he didn't use excessive force. He simply followed the procedure, a procedure twisted by the suspicious eyes he had trained through countless shifts. To him, Celeste didn't have to act dangerous. Her composure alone was enough to make him feel out of control. Behind Rick, the crowd had stopped breathing the way it did before. No one raised their voice, no one dared to intervene, but everyone saw, and it was their gaze, unwilling, unblinking gaze, that began to transform an ordinary airport morning into an unspoken indictment. Someone in the crowd raised their phone, silently recording the moment Celeste was restrained. No shouting, no chaos, but the camera shook slightly from cold hands, and in that lens the image of an older black woman standing tall, silent, handcuffed for being too precise in her politeness, was an image no one could unsee, deny, or deflect. Celeste stood there like a statue cast from historical endurance, from centuries of silence, from countless times being pressed down so others could pass. But she did not fall, she did not break, and Rick, though he had cuffed her, had forced her still, felt no relief, because deep down he knew he wasn't the one in control. He had just signed his name onto a list he would never be smart enough to escape. 1 minute later, the overhead speaker repeated the familiar announcement. Flight 6731, boarding is now closed. But every eye, every lens, every thought in that terminal was fixed on one woman who was not allowed to board. Not because she lacked a ticket, but because someone had decided a ticket wasn't enough if her skin was the wrong color. And from the moment those cuffs clicked shut, this was no longer about a flight. It was about something far larger and far heavier. Just as the announcement boarding closed ended, another beep rang out. Not from a ticket scanner, but from the phone screen of a young man standing 5 meters from Celeste. He was live streaming. The camera had been rolling since the moment Rick began handcuffing her, but now it was set to public mode. The signal was stable. The image was crisp. Celeste's face, though turned slightly to the side, appeared in full, calm, silent, unresisting, yet unmoving. As for Rick, Only part of his shoulder and jaw were in frame, but it was enough to capture the full arrogance that poorly timed authority tends to reveal. The crowd began to share. A member of a student group on an academic trip raised a second phone, opening TikTok. "You believe this? 5K views in 3 minutes?" The one beside him replied plainly, "No, 10. And at that very moment, a third person added, 12 already. The caption went up instantly, unedited. "Auntie arrested for boarding too politely. Welcome to America." Rick didn't see it yet. He was still standing like a cattle driver pretending to be a lieutenant colonel, neck bulging, shoulders braced, gaze feigning indifference. But others had seen. They looked at one another. They looked around. The atmosphere began to change. No one spoke loudly, but everyone understood. From this moment on, every move, every glance, every word would be captured, magnified, shared, and never recalled. A second world had just opened, and in it there were no exemptions for those hiding behind uniform. Rick realized it when he saw the phone aimed directly at him. He frowned and marched toward the young man. "Turn that off, or I'll—" His sentence never finished because a hand rose between him and the camera. A tall, lean, black student wearing glasses and a crossbody bag stood his ground. His voice wasn't loud, but each word landed cleanly, without an inch of retreat. "Or you'll— what? Arrest another person?" The question wasn't for Rick. It was aimed squarely at the silent crowd. Like a stone dropped into what had seemed a still lake, it unleashed a ripple effect no one could stop. Rick faltered for half a second. He looked at the student, then glanced around. Cameras were sprouting like mushrooms after rain. A middle-aged white man in a blazer was also recording. An elderly Asian woman by the gate was live-streaming on Facebook. The people Rick had assumed were silent were simply recording. He turned back to look at Celeste. She still stood there, back straight, hands cuffed, head tilted slightly, eyes forward. And just as he turned, she too tilted her head, meeting his gaze. Not with fury, not with blame, not with a threat, just a look. Sharp as a blade, still as stone, and cold in a way he could never touch. The camera zoomed at that exact moment, that frame. Celeste's sideways glance over her shoulder became the image that defined the entire incident. It became the cover photo for 300 articles in the days that followed. It was printed, color-corrected, quoted, and shared over 2 million times in 3 days. But at that moment, Rick didn't know. He only felt the chill crawl down his spine. A white passenger, middle-aged, with speckled facial hair, who had been standing silently in the back row of seats, quietly stepped toward the students. He wasn't filming. He didn't raise his voice. He only murmured, "That's the first time I've ever seen an elderly woman handcuffed and still stand that straight." His voice was raspy, choked with a feeling that hadn't yet been named. Shame, for all the times he'd witnessed too much and said nothing, or perhaps awkward admiration for a woman who didn't flinch, even when submerged in contempt. By now, Rick saw the main recorder being shielded by the crowd. He stepped back, intending to turn toward Celeste and say something to salvage the moment, but it was too late. A flurry of messages buzzed into a nearby airport employee's phone. The young woman opened her screen, and there it was, Celeste's image in gleaming metal cuffs, front and center on the homepage. A message popped up. "Mom, I just saw her get arrested at the airport I work at. What's going on?" From her middle school daughter. And the mother, staring at the real woman in front of her, suddenly didn't know what to say. In an instant, the airport was no longer just an airport. It had become a crime scene. No blood, no bullets, no body, but a kind of slow execution by humiliation. A social homicide, where the victim does not fall, but is filed away as someone fated to endure invisibly. Rick didn't notice, but Celeste did. She read every gaze. She felt the shift in the crowd. Not passive anymore, but slowly waking up. She knew who was filming. She knew how much the camera had captured. But she stood still. No shouting, no explanation. no performance, because she knew in this era you no longer needed to speak to prove anything. One image at the right moment would become irrefutable evidence, and she had become living proof of a truth long buried, that there are still people in uniform who disregard human dignity, that civility can be seen as a scheme. Doing things right holds no value when the one in power refuses to recognize it, and that, sometimes, standing still is a form of resistance. Online, the view count exploded. 20,000, then 30, then 50. The first comments rolled in. "What the hell? She didn't do anything wrong. I was on that flight last week. They don't check tickets this hard. They cuffed an old woman for being too polite. We're doomed." A new hashtag was born. Gate 12 shame. And just like that, the story no longer belonged to Gate 12. It had crossed security lines, outpaced the PA system, and outgrown airport regulations. It spilled outward, onto screens, into hearts. Rick began to feel the atmosphere truly shift. He looked around and saw the eyes. No longer eyes of deference, no longer eyes of caution, only eyes that had awakened, watching, judging, but saying nothing. A verdict without a judge. No lawyers, no courtroom, because Rick, through his petty, malicious act, had testified against himself. Celeste remained silent, still hadn't said a word, but her eyes, those eyes, were now being seen by thousands simultaneously. Not in conference chairs, not in portraits hung in official halls, but in a 16:9 frame from the phone of a student with no title, no authority, who had captured a truth no official report would dare to write, a truth cold, clear, and tight, no footnotes needed. And from that moment on, everything that followed, federal investigations, congressional hearings, or the reckoning of an entire system, was simply the aftermath of one well-timed recording, a camera that couldn't lie, a lens that chose no sides, and one gaze, from a woman who refused to bow. The frame was still there, the gaze still pierced into Rick's mind like a wordless verdict, but he could no longer back down, not because of regulations, but because of ego, the wounded pride of a man who had just lost control under the camera's eye, now chose to strike back the only way he knew how, by exercising flimsy authority disguised as protecting the public. He turned without asking, without announcing, and bent over to open the crossbody leather bag at Celeste's side. The cuffs on her wrists clinked faintly. No resistance, no struggle. She simply tilted her head slightly, looking directly at what he was doing, as if to memorize every motion, every finger, every violation, and let him walk himself into his downfall without lifting a finger. Rick pulled out the laptop. Small, sleek, charcoal-colored, no visible logo on the casing. He tapped the lid. No recognizable brand. He squinted at a string of serial numbers on the bottom left edge, then powered it on. The screen lit up. A logo appeared. Not Microsoft, not Apple, not anything he'd ever seen. As soon as he touched the trackpad, the screen blinked, and a red warning appeared. Federal Oversight Level V violation, attempt logged. Below it, a flashing alarm code, pulsing with the rhythm of Rick's accelerating heartbeat. Unrecognized access. Federal liaison protocol is active. 1 second, then 2. Rick stepped back, but his mouth wasn't ready to let go. He forced a nasal chuckle, a mocking laugh meant to mask panic. A laptop like this? Guess it's not for regular folks, huh? It landed like a death rattle. But this time, no one laughed. No nods, just a chilling silence, as if everyone present was watching a man slip a noose around his own neck and insist it was a tie. At the security coordination desk behind them, an airport technician happened to glance at the network activity monitor. He saw a connection pinging from the laptop Rick was holding, saw the alert, saw the red M72 code flash across the entire internal system. His face drained of color. No need to ask, no need to inform a supervisor. He pulled out his phone and called the emergency federal hotline number, the one you're given for situations that should never happen. And today, it just had. Rick still had no idea. He thought he was in control. He saw people staring and assumed they were afraid, assumed they were impressed. But he didn't see the camera still recording, didn't see the flood of comments pouring in, didn't see someone rushing into the command office behind him, didn't grasp the simplest truth, that in trying to justify his mistake, he had triggered a process far beyond his clearance level, and one that he couldn't stop. He picked up his radio, voice brittle. "Need support at Gate 12. I may be holding evidence of a potential threat. Prepare for detailed questioning." Each word sounded like an empty indictment. But this time, the target wasn't just a woman standing upright. It was a system he didn't understand, couldn't control, and didn't know was now watching him in real time. No one answered his radio. Not yet, anyway. What Rick didn't realize was that the moment he opened the laptop, the federal alert system had automatically locked signal access in that zone. And when that happens, every word spoken, every move is logged, stored, analyzed, and used against the one who triggered it. Someone 10 paces behind Celeste quietly took a screenshot. The red alert warning, and Rick's hand on the laptop was captured. A minute later, the image began circulating on Twitter. Caption: "Crimes begin when someone touches what they don't understand but believe they have the right to destroy." Rick stepped back toward Celeste, shaking the laptop in her face like some fabricated piece of evidence. "Care to explain this? Seems pretty important." She looked at him, not with fear, not with disdain, but as if listening to a child mispronounce a word it didn't understand. Then she turned away, said nothing. Rick took that silence not as a refusal to talk, but a refusal to acknowledge his standing to be answered. To him, her silence was humiliation. He couldn't refused to admit, that in this entire encounter he had never been the one asking questions. He was just a minor character pretending to be the scriptwriter. Meanwhile, 300 meters away in the airport's security control room, the central monitor flashed an auxiliary dashboard. "Federal oversight breach detected. Command pending." Another window opened. "Lock Gate 12. A mid-level supervisor hesitated for 2 seconds, then clicked confirm. The boarding gate closed. A small mechanical thunk echoed, enough to make people flinch. Passengers began to realize this was no longer a routine check. This was an incident, a crisis. And at the center of that crisis wasn't Celeste. It was a security officer who had let arrogance override judgment, prejudice cloud procedure, and temporary authority obscure ethical limits. Rick stepped back, scanning the crowd, looking for support from the people who'd always backed him, but now there was only silence. No one moved closer, no one intervened. Not even his superiors radioed back. All channels had gone quiet. No one wanted to stand next to a man who had accessed a federally encrypted device without clearance. No one wanted their name in the incident report. And Rick, despite the uniform, the badge, the buzzwords like threat, interrogation, security, was no longer a public servant. He was now a living indictment of a system gone rotten, where power came without knowledge, where those issued weapons didn't know their limits, where the word suspicion was wielded not to protect but to oppress. Celeste said nothing, but every pair of eyes turning toward her and toward Rick was a closing argument. No one needed to write a report. No one needed a defense. No one needed a verdict, because it was already clear the one in handcuffs was not the criminal. The one shouting about security was the danger. Rick still held the laptop as if he had just extracted evidence from a national conspiracy. His chin was raised, his eyes darting with a mix of caution and smugness. In his mind, Celeste was no longer just a polite woman mistakenly detained. She had morphed into a modern embodiment of every threat he'd seen on late-night news. Unusually affluent, dressed above her station, carrying strange equipment, and far too calm to be innocent. All of that, in Rick's mind, was the signature of a covert operation. And he, as always, believed he was the only one in the airport sharp enough to sniff it out. What he didn't know was that the laptop had just transmitted a top-secret encrypted signal, an automatic sequence initiated, piercing through internal network layers, temporarily overriding airport security protocols. and triggering a level of alert never before recorded in the passenger control system's operational history. On the main surveillance monitor in the airport's security command center, a red message appeared: clean, steady, not flashing, but dropping the room's temperature by several degrees. Breach of oversight protocol M72. None of the on-duty staff knew what M72 was, but they knew one thing: that line didn't appear due to a technical error, and any procedure that followed it didn't require their permission. A second later, the chief supervisor's radio crackled, this time not from the internal patrol team, but from the emergency line that only activates when the system shifts status. Lock gate 12, initiate internal oversight, maximum priority. No explanation. No one questioned it. No one dared. The operator hit the red button, and the auto-lock system at Gate 12 engaged, not with a dramatic clang, but with a discreet snap that still made nearby passengers turn their heads. The steel door slid shut slowly, sealing like a verdict without a jury. Rick turned around, watching it closely, confused. He squinted, raised his radio. Gate 12 is being remotely controlled. Who's authorizing direct override of this sector? No one answered, because at that moment, he was no longer central to any chain of command. He had accidentally triggered a tier of power that did not exist in the world he thought he knew, and now all that remained for him was to flounder in a flood of information for which he had no map. An undercover federal oversight agent had just left the tech room. No uniform, no badge, no credentials shown. He issued one sentence in a flat, emotionless voice that left no room for question. Anyone who made contact with her must be verified at a federal level. The recipient of the order didn't ask for clarification. They saw the man's eyes and immediately understood he wasn't making a suggestion. He had just been informed that someone in the crowd was not to be touched, and anyone who already had would pay the price. Rick still didn't know. He pointed to the laptop. I may be holding evidence tied to a federal intervention plot. He stressed the word federal as if it gave him divine authority. In his eyes, Celeste was no longer a victim, she was a target. A suspect is to be restrained, accused, and exposed in public. But the crowd no longer listened to him. Their eyes had moved past the man shouting about conspiracies and toward the woman who remained silent. Celeste hadn't budged. Her hands were still cuffed behind her. Her posture hadn't shifted an inch, and it was that stillness, that near-regal composure, that made people step back, because no one could stand among an angry crowd under armed scrutiny with a ranting officer spinning chaos and hold a gaze like hers, unshaken, unmoving, unafraid. Rick, though unwilling to admit it, felt it. He snapped into his radio. "Where's backup? I'm with a subject showing clear security anomalies, and I've been left alone?" His voice cracked with the first signs of panic. Not because someone had pushed back, but because no one was responding. He had been severed from the system he once thought was his. Trapped between two layers of authority, one old, brash, and flawed, the other new, silent, and conveyed through glances and symbols he'd never been trained to recognize. A young airport employee stepped forward and extended his hand. "I'll take the laptop." "You don't have clearance to hold it without a Tier 3 directive." Rick stepped back. "Who are you?" The man said nothing, just handed him a card. No name, only a silver octagon embossed. Rick stared at it, confused, when another command came. "Place it on the table. Now." Rick obeyed, not because the man had a weapon, not because he was threatened, but because, for the first time, Rick feared something he couldn't see, a power that didn't wear uniforms, didn't raise its voice, didn't summon reinforcements, a power that didn't need to declare itself, because it had always been there, and Rick had just touched it by mistake. Celeste said nothing, but no one dared call her a passenger anymore. No one asked for her ticket, no one cared why she was there, because now she was no longer a person. She was a signal, a statement, the convergence point between an old system, where people like Rick controlled through suspicion, and a new order, where the mere presence of a black woman standing upright in silence was evidence that justice no longer sleeps. And Gate 12, once just a boarding gate, had become a threshold between two worlds. On one side, a man who believed he had power because he wore a badge. On the other hand, a woman who had lost all privilege except her dignity. And in that moment, Rick Hardwell finally understood, in the most painful way, that sometimes a door doesn't close to keep someone out. It closes to lock in the one who no longer belongs on the right side. The airport felt more crowded in silence, not because more people had arrived, but because every gaze, every breath, every camera was now trained on one woman who still hadn't uttered a single word, a woman in handcuffs, standing still, neither lowering her head nor reacting, yet shifting the entire system's tone simply by remaining. And she still hadn't said who she was. Rick began to sense something slipping out of his hands, though he lacked the depth to name it. All he knew was that this woman wasn't like anyone he'd ever checked. No resistance, no pleading, no justifications. Her silence was like a thick sheet of ice, and he, with his crude, cutting tongue, was merely a man on the shore, tossing stones at a frozen surface that refused to crack. He spoke up, trying to reclaim control, like an off-topic MC. Full name, no response. Occupation, silence. Purpose of travel, itinerary, sponsor, not a word. No one knew whether she could hear him, but everyone understood that she was listening. She didn't react, but her eyes never left Rick. A steady, direct gaze, not bitter, not mocking. It didn't look like the eyes of someone being detained. It looked like the eyes of a judge watching a candidate fail an ethical test, too poorly to realize they'd already lost. Rick's voice sharpened. "You think silence is going to make me back off? You think someone's coming to save you?" He stepped closer, lowering himself as if shrinking his height might amplify his authority. But all it did was expose a face unraveling under a gaze that needed no weapon to strike. The crowd kept watching. For a brief moment, no one paid attention to their timelines, no one looked away from their screens, because they all sensed that any second they blinked, they might miss a moment that would shift their worldview. A handcuffed woman stood there, not screaming to prove she was right, and that alone made people start asking, if she's wrong, why isn't she panicking? If she's harmless, why is she restrained? And if she's dangerous, why does the man confronting her seem more unsettled than she is? An airport employee, white, late 40s, leaned toward a colleague behind the baggage check area. "I think I've seen her before. Last year's Global Economic Summit, right? I think there's a clip of her talking about international budget structures. The voice is the same." The colleague didn't reply. He was too focused on Celeste's face, where every feature, every micro-movement didn't perform, but commanded. It wasn't arrogance. It was a precise awareness of her position and the irrelevance of the man trying to control her. Rick overheard the whisper and seized the chance to throw cold water on what he thought was delusion. "Don't idolize her. Hollywood's rotted your brains." The words came out both bitter and pathetic, like someone who smashed a luxury car's window with a brick, then claimed it was just dirt. Rick still believed Celeste was fabricating some saintly persona to mask something sinister. To him, silence had only two meanings, either defiance or manipulation. He lacked the framework to grasp that, for some, silence is the final and fiercest declaration. A young female passenger live streaming on Instagram held her phone at shoulder height. She said nothing. No commentary. But a few seconds later, she typed a caption beneath the feed. "This woman carries herself in a way that makes me feel ashamed for standing still." The text appeared beneath the frame, where Rick was speaking nonsense, and Celeste stood expressionless, unmoved. Her silence didn't make people uncomfortable. On the contrary, it made them face the noise inside their heads. It forced every witness to ask themselves, if I were treated like that, could I stand still? If I were her, would I explode? Would I curse back, cry? But she did none of those, and that made her untouchable, because Rick had no idea where to strike when his opponent neither shielded nor swung back. Rick stepped back. Tiny fractures started forming in his mind. He had yelled, interrogated, tried to drown Celeste in pressure. screamed in the outdated dialect of the old system, and still she didn't budge. And the worst thing for men like him is realizing that someone can win without ever fighting him. He felt himself shrinking, not in size, but in presence. He began to diminish before a woman who had said nothing, done nothing, resisted nothing. When he realized he'd lost control of the narrative, he did what desperate men always do. He blamed. "You're violating the cooperation protocol. I have the right to report you as non-compliant." The words rang dry and hollow, like a busted fire alarm trying to warn of a blaze everyone already saw coming. Celeste didn't move, didn't reply. Her eyes maintained their intensity, like a spotlight on a bad actor who doesn't know when to leave the stage. And in that instant, something shifted. Rick, though unaware, was beginning to be consumed by the very power vacuum he'd created. He thought he was investigating. In truth, he was being watched. He thought he was interrogating. In truth, he was being judged. Not by law, not by his superiors, but by a society no longer willing to tolerate watching someone be diminished for simply standing upright. Rick said nothing more, not because he understood, but because he feared what might be revealed if he kept speaking. He took another step back, scanning the room, not to give orders, but to look for an ally. But no one looked at him with eyes awaiting direction. They only looked, as one looks at someone who's just made an irreversible mistake and doesn't yet realize what they've lost. Celeste still hadn't spoken, but the world around her had already changed, and Rick, the man who thought he was the gatekeeper, had now retreated into the shadow of his unraveling. Celeste's gaze remained unchanged, still deep, unhurried, unmoving, unguarded, and therefore untouchable. Rick, though he had already stepped back a few paces, still clung to the tone of someone in control, like a lone wolf howling out an old predatory instinct to mask the chill settling beneath its thinning skin. He turned toward the student still live streaming, pointed directly at him, voice nearly hissing. "You think live streaming counts as evidence? You want to get fined for interfering with a law enforcement officer?" No one responded. The student held his phone steady. Another was filming from a different angle. Rick began to feel like he was trapped on a stage no one had built, but thousands were watching, and none had cast him as the lead. He turned to the coordination desk, pressed his radio close, and spat each word through gritted teeth. "Gate 12 requires backup. Situation exceeding protocol, signs of abnormal equipment and non-cooperative behavior from the female subject, flagged under code M72, requesting verification from the upper command." At the same moment, several corridors beyond the gate where Rick stood, in the airport's auxiliary control room, an unexpected direct call came through. No switchboard, no intercom, no app. The internal screen flashed, "Incoming call, secure line, Federal Oversight Unit." The room's duty officer, Winslow, a veteran sergeant with years of night shifts under his belt, had never seen that signal. He glanced at the screen, hand just beginning to rise, when the ringing stopped and a voice came through a separate, isolated speaker. The voice was clear, emotionless, like something read by artificial intelligence. "M72 has been breached. Seal the zone. Cease all interaction. Any engagement with the subject is to be terminated immediately. Oversight Command will assume control. No acknowledgement required." The transmission ended. No confirmation requested. No space left for questions. Sergeant Winslow broke into a cold sweat. 1 second later, as if by primal instinct, he whispered, "Roger, federal emergency." His tired eyes, worn from years of uneventful shifts, now stared at a door to hell creaking open. He didn't call a supervisor. He didn't double-check. He simply reached down, typed in the emergency override code, shut off all auxiliary communication lines, and began rerouting full operational control of Gate 12 to the Federal Rapid Response Unit, an entity he had only heard of during theoretical emergency drills. Back at Gate 12, Rick still stood on a stage whose scenery had begun changing behind his back. He continued barking into his radio. I need a supervisor. Why is no one answering? I've just detected a network security breach from a laptop marked with code M72. He emphasized M72 like a man who believed he'd just cracked the code to a terrorist plot. But instead of hearing approaching boots or backup, what he got was something else. A short, dry, static hiss from his radio. Then came a flat voice, even and cold, as if pre-recorded. Cease all communication with subject M72. Command from Oversight. Coordination of Gate 12 is now under federal takeover. Rick froze. He blinked. He didn't understand. He wasn't trained for this. The phrase, under federal takeover, wasn't part of his vocabulary. He opened his mouth to ask, but the radio had already been cut off. All channels are dead. The indicator light glowed red. He had just been locked out of the official command system. A young airport staffer passed nearby, trying not to meet Rick's eyes, but too late. Rick grabbed his arm and snarled, "Who gave that order? Which oversight? I'm the one in charge here." The staffer pulled his arm back, glanced nervously, then muttered under his breath, barely loud enough for the person beside him to hear, "Idiot just touched what no one else dares to." The colleague gave a small nod. No one laughed. No one objected. Just a quiet, grim acknowledgement. No one took pleasure in watching a colleague about to be crushed, but no one dared to pull him off the tracks with the oversight train bearing down. Rick wasn't done. He turned back to Celeste. Her cuffs were still locked behind her back, still standing straight, still looking forward, but this time her eyes were no longer focused on Rick. She looked through him, not with disdain, but with erasure, as if he had been removed from her list of considerations, no longer worthy of analysis, not worth speaking to, not even relevant enough for confrontation. Something cold and unnamed began creeping down Rick's spine. He didn't understand why everything was silent. Why did no one speak? Why all the radios had gone dead? Why had the gate locked without alerting him? Why did no one back him anymore? And why all the eyes that once regarded him as the enforcer of justice now looked at him like a man who had just done something irreversible? Rick's fatal naivete wasn't that he didn't know he was wrong. It was that he thought being right would protect him. In his mind, everything still operated on a linear model. Suspicion, inspection, discovery, resolution, reward. He had never learned how to navigate non-linear models, where silence could weigh more than a verdict, where a glance could override command, where a single misstep on a device could trigger an entire government-level defense protocol he never knew existed. A high-ranking federal security officer just activated by oversight was now approaching from Corridor 6. No uniform, no name badge, no words spoken, but every airport staffer who saw him instinctively stepped back half a pace. He didn't need to show credentials. He was the credential. He didn't need to announce authority. The way he read the control panel, without scanning, without hesitation, was enough for everyone to understand. This was a man who didn't need to ask. This was a man who always knew. And if he were here, then the situation was far beyond anything any shift worker had ever dealt with. Rick hadn't seen him yet. He was still pacing, spinning like a caged animal, looking for an ally's voice. But he didn't know. All voices had just gone dark, and for the first time he had no channel left to scream into, no radio to command from, no position from which to demand, no authority left to question. Celeste still stood there. Not a word, not a motion, but her stillness had become the epicenter of an invisible quake reshaping the power structure, from Washington to the terminal, from encrypted devices to dead radios, from oversight signals to a voiceless call. It all began with a single signal. The signal had only just been sent from somewhere far away when its presence materialized right here. No footsteps, no sirens, no barked commands to clear the way. The man appeared as if he had never been absent. A charcoal gray coat, collar raised, only 2 buttons fastened. His eyes didn't need to squint to narrow the room itself. He didn't look at anyone, didn't need an introduction. In a world where power usually must announce itself to be recognized, he was the embodiment of another kind of order, one in which mere presence was enough to cause everything else to step down. He stopped in front of Rick, not too close, but leaving no room for doubt. His left hand extended a card. No wasted words, no wasted motion. Illuminated by the sterile glow of the security monitors, the card bore the emblem of Federal Oversight, a unit that never needed advertising, because its very mention turned every moral presentation into dust. Rick swallowed, but forced himself to speak. He gave a slight chin raise, squinted at the card like he was hunting for a typo. There was none. Just one line beneath the silver seal. Authorized for Tier Z intervention, no clearance required. He didn't fully understand it, but Rick knew this wasn't a regular man. For the first time in a long time, he felt something he had forgotten: limits. The agent folded the card and slid it into the inner pocket of his coat. His gaze never shifted to Rick. It cut through him, as if no words were needed to establish the new hierarchy. Then he turned to a nearby airport staffer and spoke just loud enough to be heard, but not louder than necessary. "She is under national-level protection. Anyone who touches her won't hold a position after today." One sentence, one tier of power, one final line drawn between those who still had standing and the one who had just been removed from the board. No one reacted immediately. The entire terminal fell into a strange kind of silence. Not stillness, but the sensation that a regime had just been dethroned in full public view without a drop of blood. There were no guns, no courtroom, no announced verdict, but everyone understood someone had just lost the right to decide, and that someone was Rick. Rick turned to the agent, voice rising like a man cornered against a cliff wall. "Who is she supposed to be?" He tried to laugh, the strained, bitter laugh of someone who just watched the throne pulled out from under him without seeing who moved it. The agent didn't respond immediately. He adjusted his cuff, then spoke, each word sharpened. "She is someone you were instructed never to disrespect, even with a glance." A choked sob echoed from behind. A young female employee, not yet 30, stood frozen by the coordination desk. Tears spilled down her face as if someone had just ripped off the protective shell she wore every shift. The shell of silence, passivity, and compliance with injustice. She didn't cry out of fear. She cried because she realized she had stood inches from injustice and done nothing, and now it was too late to undo it. Rick stepped back. His face began to pale, but he didn't collapse. No, men like Rick don't fall for the right reasons. They only fall when no one listens to them anymore. He raised his hand and pointed at the agent, voice sharp. "Are you people kidding me? Someone who won't give her name, won't speak, won't cooperate, and she gets national protection?" The question wasn't asked to get an answer. It was a final thrash of ego. The thing Rick thought would shield him from being erased from every system he ever clung to. The agent didn't flinch, didn't smile, didn't twist the knife. Only his voice, low, level, and scalpel sharp. "We're not kidding. And she won't sue you, because she'll prove you're not even worth suing." That sentence, short, quiet, sliced through the last thin skin of Rick's false authority. For a fleeting moment, one could see him choke, not because he was attacked, but because, for the first time, he'd been denied even the right to argue. No applause, no cheers, no one shouted, "That's right," or "Justice," no slogans. Just silence, majestic like a ceremonial deposition. No blood, no protest. Just one person silent enough to set the standard, and one too loud to realize he'd just erased himself. Rick lowered his head, not in guilt, but to search for a familiar look. A nod of support. Someone to say, "You did the right thing," but no one did. No one stood with him. No one still believed he was doing his job. He was just the last one who thought he was right. Celeste still stood, hands still cuffed, eyes still fixed. But in this moment, no one saw the cuffs anymore. No one remembered she had been detained for screening. All they saw was someone disrespected and did not bow. Someone silent, who had forced the entire system to recalibrate its understanding of power. Someone not a symbol, who did what a whole generation of silence had never dared to do, stand still under the weight of every gaze meant to crush her, and make those gazes turn away. And Rick, from the man who thought he embodied justice, now stood at the edge of a historic moment. like a supporting character who forgot his lines, removed from the scene by a single nod from those with actual authority. No one said her name. No one announced her title, but everyone now knew she wasn't just a black woman. She was the final boundary that this system was never meant to cross. The federal oversight agent's final words still lingered in the air. She will only prove you are no longer worth suing. And as if that sentence alone was the final command in an unceremonious ritual, Rick began to be removed from the very system he once believed was his impenetrable armor. A man in a regional management uniform approached from the right. He said nothing, only handed Rick a transparent envelope. Inside was a yellow form labeled Temporary Removal of Clearance. Rick frowned, barely reacting before the man's voice followed, flat, quiet, but undeniable. Surrender your weapon, radio, ID badge. The command was like a cold blade severing the last thread connecting Rick to the authority he used to invoke any time he wanted someone silent. Rick stood motionless for a beat, as if staying still might convince them this was a mistake. But no one thought that. No one had doubts. No one felt the need to say anything else to confirm what was already clear. This wasn't a courtroom. But Rick was standing where, for the first time in his life, justice needed no defense. He pulled out his badge first. Under the fluorescent light, the silver-tinged card showed his name, Rick Hardwell, title, Officer First Response. Below were region codes, security clearances, expiration dates, and a discrete line of code known only within the agency. It signified his right to request backup without explanation. He stared at the card for a few more seconds, then dropped it into the plastic sleeve without being told. Next came the radio, the same device he had once clenched to summon an entire system behind him. He unhooked it from his belt and handed it over, slowly but without resistance. Finally, the Glock 19 was in his holster. He flipped the safety, removed it from the holster, and set it down on a nearby metal counter. No one counted, no one logged inventory, because this was no longer about equipment. This was about identity, about a man being stripped of the last layer of skin he thought was his own. Rick stepped half a pace back and forced a smile. But it was no longer the smile of a man in control, only the final twitch of a fox being skinned alive in the middle of the market square, where no one saw him as a threat anymore. His voice rang out into the hallway. I was doing my duty. The cry rang harsh, discordant, like a scream abandoned by the very logic he once used to excuse every violation. But this time, no one nodded. No one agreed. No eye offered sympathy. No voice rose in support. A younger guard, at least 10 years Rick's junior, watched him quietly for a moment before replying, voice firm but soft, and I'm doing mine. Removing you because you just compromised national honor. It wasn't meant to insult. It was a reminder. Some duties require no badge, only clarity. Rick lifted his head, eyes reddening. He hissed through clenched teeth. I didn't know. For the first time in that long, agonizing morning, he said something true. But that truth was no longer enough to redeem the cost of his ignorance. Because sometimes, not knowing doesn't make you innocent. It makes you dangerous. The oversight agent's voice cut in sharp as a scalpel. It's precisely because you didn't know that you're a threat. Rick stepped back again. He had nowhere left to stand. No reason to remain close. No one pushed him. No one yelled. No one told him to leave. But the air around him tightened. And though his body still stood, Rick had been pushed beyond the moral boundary everyone else was silently committed to protect. The crowd no longer filmed, no longer whispered. They simply stood, silent, upright, as if attending a funeral of honor, without a casket, without eulogy, but all sensing something had just been buried. Not a man, an illusion. And Rick, still alive, was no longer himself. One passenger in a gray suit didn't record, didn't speak, he simply jotted something into a notebook. No one saw the words then, but later, the note would circulate more widely than any official report. I watched a man press delete on his dignity. Rick stood there, not knowing where to go. He was no longer allowed near Celeste, a 10-meter radius marked not by tape or signs, but by the quiet retreat of a society that understood. Some borders can't be crossed if you want to keep your decency intact. Rick had already crossed that line and now had no ticket back in. Celeste still stood, unchanged in posture, hands cuffed, but now no one saw the cuffs anymore. No one remembered she was once detained for questioning. They saw only a woman, disrespected but unbowed, a woman speechless who made the entire system recalibrate its metric of power, a woman, not a symbol, but someone who had done what an entire silent generation never dared, stand still in the face of all eyes that wished her erased, and make those very eyes look away. And Rick, who once thought himself an enforcer of justice, now stood at the edge of a historic moment, like a bit player who hadn't learned his lines, dismissed from the script with a single nod from those who held authority. No one said her name, no one announced her title, but everyone understood she wasn't just a black woman. She was the final line this system was never meant to cross. Rick had vanished from the frame. The spot where he once stood, chest puffed, finger pointed, voice raised, now lay empty, as though no one had ever occupied it. But everyone knew that space wasn't meaningless. It was the residue of a dismantled order, disassembled in front of hundreds of witnesses, not by legal precedent, not by courtroom procedure, but by a silence held long enough and a gaze that refused to look away. The federal oversight agent had stepped back into Corridor 3, leaving behind an open space like an unbuilt stage, where no one acted, no lines were rehearsed, no scripts were read, yet something historic was etched into memory. Celeste still stood there. Her wrists were still bound by cuffs. Her black suit remained neatly pressed. Her gaze carried no fire, no tears, and because of that, everything around her began to still, like the surface of water moments before it breaks into waves. Then she spoke. No one asked her to. No one introduced her. No one prompted her. But as soon as she began her first sentence, the entire Gate 12 fell silent, as if someone had hit a mute button on the world. It wasn't that her voice was loud. On the contrary, her tone was low, even, neither strained nor emotional. Yet each word felt compressed by the gravity of a lifetime spent standing in the shadows without ever bowing. My name is Celeste Ruth Coleman. The first 4 words, without title, without rank, without grandeur. Yet the moment they were spoken, every raised phone lifted higher, and every bystander holding their breath fell completely still. Federal advisor, defense budget oversight, global financial aid coordination, her tone didn't change. No pride, no intention to command reverence, just clarity, each word slicing through the decayed arrogance of a system that had let a man cuff her without even asking her name. In the far left corner, the young woman live streaming let out a soft gasp. Her eyes were bloodshot, her cheeks were streaked with tears, yet her hands remained steady, the signal clear, the frame unbroken, because she knew that if she flinched now, an entire generation might lose proof that history changed direction on an otherwise ordinary morning. Celeste didn't stop. No one interrupted. No one coughed. No one moved. I came here to sign a famine relief agreement. A simple sentence. No jargon, no rhetorical punch, but within it a full indictment that someone holding the lives of millions had been detained simply for bringing the wrong skin tone into the right protocol. And now I must report that I've just been handcuffed. Not an accusation, not retaliation, just a report. But because it was spoken as fact, not as a wound, the entire Gate 12 turned heavier than a courtroom. The air no longer floated light enough to breathe. Every molecule seemed pinned down by something people thought had been left in the past, only now it had returned, colder, sharper, because this time it had been captured from every angle. The young woman lowered her phone. Her stream stopped. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed. No one comforted her. No one turned to look, because her weeping wasn't weakness. It was the gasp of a generation realizing a truth textbooks never taught, that justice doesn't come from memorizing statutes, but from having the courage to name wrongs the moment they unfold before your eyes. Celeste didn't look at anyone, didn't seek affirmation, didn't wait for applause. She stared straight ahead, as though there were still a path no one had yet walked to its end. Then she spoke one last sentence. Not a conclusion, but a slow, closing heartbeat, echoing into the listener's chest. The last time I was restrained like this, I was a child, watching my mother being dragged off a bus. A faint sound rang out, like a chair leg softly striking the floor, not because someone fell, but because someone stood up. Too suddenly, unable to bear hearing a woman like her speak in such chilling calm, of a shame that had lingered for over half a century. She paused, not for drama, but because the next truth needed to stand alone, like a stone laid on a grave no one dares unearth. The second time is today. Something ripped quietly through someone's chest, like the air had been vacuumed from the room. No one cried aloud, but many bowed their heads, not because they pitied her, but because they had just seen themselves and realized how long they had stood by while justice was being shredded in plain sight, still confident they were not involved. No one said anything more. Nothing needed to be said, because in just 12 sentences, Celeste had accomplished what 30 years of congressional debate had not. She forced an entire system to look at its reflection through the face of a woman standing still, handcuffed, but never subdued. She didn't need to flash credentials. She didn't hand out a business card. She didn't offer a defense. She simply stood in the exact spot at the exact moment when everyone who had once dodged the truth was now forced to lift their heads and witness it. And she had done it, not to win, but to remind the world that some people don't need a podium to silence an entire terminal. Her name was Celeste Ruth Coleman, and now everyone knew. Less than an hour later, the live stream footage captured by the young college student appeared on CNN's noon broadcast. No clickbait headline, no dramatic music, just a single white line against a black background. Cuffed at gate. Oversight breach involving federal advisor Celeste Ruth Coleman. The story spread like wildfire across a dry forest, not because of emotion, but because of the undeniable weight of a truth no one could evade anymore. The hashtag #CuffedAtGate first appeared on Twitter at 11:43 a.m. By 12:06, it topped national trends. By 1:20 p.m., it was a global phenomenon. Within 2 hours, Rick Hardwell's identity had been uncovered by the very people he once assumed were too uneducated to search. His image, smug face, distorted mouth mid-shout, finger jabbing at the camera, was pulled from 4 separate angles, edited into a loop that viewers replayed just to see absurdity magnified in wide-angle 4K. But what truly ignited public outrage wasn't the image of Celeste in handcuffs. It was another video, dug up from internal archives, recorded the previous year. In it, Rick Hardwell was interrogating a Latino man in a delivery company uniform at security checkpoint B9. No reason, no offense, just because the man was speaking Spanish while traveling alone. That clip lasted only 38 seconds, but it unleashed a flood of suppressed files. A former TSA employee, a black woman who had worked the night shift at the airport, posted a short video on TikTok. No tears, no theatrics, just a direct stare into the lens. I reported Rick 3 times. Once for insulting a black passenger, once for detaining an underage Asian kid without cause, once for questioning a Muslim woman on Christmas Eve. No action was taken. They said I was too sensitive about race. Now, who's too sensitive? Less than 6 hours later, the federal inspector general, rarely seen on broadcast, gave a terse statement at a Washington press briefing. We're not just investigating one incident. This is a chain of collective neglect. And what's reprehensible isn't the existence of someone like Rick Hardwell, but the layers of people who chose to look away when they were supposed to look straight. That statement, an unspoken verdict, hit harder than any criminal sentence. No one needed to wait for court. No one needed to file paperwork. No signature from higher-ups was required, because justice once reawakened by truth, will find its path to places where law was too slow to go. In a windowless room with no nameplate, no signage, Rick sat before a screen. His eyes were red, his hands rested on his knees, no sidearm at his hip, no radio on his shoulder, no badge on his chest. In front of him, 5 screens, 5 camera angles, 5 unfiltered truths. In each video, he appeared not edited, not staged, not manipulated, but him, in raw form, without the gloss of authority, without the tone correction of a title. One screen showed him shouting, "I'm just doing my job." A second played the moment he snatched Celeste's ticket. Too bright. Probably not fake, right? The third replayed him handcuffing her, grip firm, head cocked, as if arresting a dangerous criminal. The fourth, from a wide angle, showed Celeste motionless, calm, not resisting, not disruptive, her only offense being her skin color. The fifth screen played the live stream, the moment Celeste turned to him, her gaze, not angry, not regretful, just a look meant for someone who had lost the privilege of being spoken to. Rick said nothing, not because he couldn't, but because for the first time in his life, every defense had already been spoken for him by his actions. Outside that room, an internal memo began circulating through federal law enforcement. Subject: immediate review of security protocols. Reassess procedures for engaging civilians without probable cause. All airports were instructed to submit lists of personnel previously reported for discriminatory behavior within the past 5 years, even if the files had been closed due to insufficient evidence, and Rick, knowingly or not, had become the key that unlocked every door the system had sealed shut with silence. No one was asking, why did Rick do it? They were asking, why did we let him do it for so long? And the answer didn't need writing. It appeared in every video, every article, every comment. Because we once believed that shame was personal, not realizing shame isn't in being cuffed. It's in allowing someone to cuff without being stopped. And today, the world relearned that lesson. Inside the busiest airport in America, taught by a woman who stood still. While the video of the incident at Gate 12 was still spreading uncontrollably across social media platforms, another audio file, without visuals, without eye contact, without footage, quietly began circulating within the U.S. Transportation Security Administration, TSA. It had no introduction, no opening segment. It wasn't posted by anyone with a recognizable name, but within 4 minutes of first being played, in a private Slack group for airport staff, the recording had already jumped to emails, text messages, and across all access road barriers. A voice emerged, dry and fragmented by ceiling fan noise and the tapping of keyboard keys. "I can't stand black women in suits walking like CEOs. One look and you know it's fake. Acting like it's real." Then came a burst of laughter, not long, but bitter enough. The kind of laugh that doesn't need anyone to join in, because the speaker already believes they have the right to laugh like that and never be questioned. The voice on the recording wasn't loud, nor was every word enunciated, but it was unmistakable. Each sentence ended with a rasp. Each phrase began with a short, clipped breath. It was the tone of someone used to giving orders, used to making judgments, and used to hiding contempt beneath the kind of neutral cadence that the system once deemed harmless. And that recording, despite showing no face, offering no context, and containing no timestamp, was enough to destroy the last wall of defense Rick had clung to: denial. AI analyzed the voice. It took less than 20 minutes to confirm. Voice analysis labs from TSA, the Department of Homeland Security, and even 2 major media networks all reached the same conclusion. The voice belonged to Rick Hardwell. Match rate, 100%. No errors, no splices, no deepfake. All it took was him. The recording wasn't just evidence. It was an indictment authored by the accused himself, like a trap he'd set for others, but that ultimately became the iron collar snapping back onto his neck while he stood playing the role of law enforcer. The audio was shared across hundreds of TSA internal groups, and in a single afternoon it became the topic no one dared sidestep. Those who had defended Rick Those who had said he was just doing his job didn't deserve this level of criticism. They were now silent, not because they suddenly thought he was wrong, but because they knew any further defense would now be read as complicity. A mid-level TSA manager in Florida sighed during an internal meeting, "We have no choice. Everyone who's worked with Rick, including those who ignored prior complaints, must write a statement of accountability." The directive didn't come with rage, but with the weary tone of those realizing they'd let a moral virus slip through and now had to sweep up every shard of the aftermath. No one objected. At the same time, the Federal Civil Rights Committee issued an official summons for Rick Hardwell to testify. The document was made public, posted on a government website. There were no dramatic phrases, just a single all-cap subject line in standard federal administrative style: oversight, failure, and pattern of bias-driven enforcement. Summons for public testimony. In other words, this wasn't about one incident. It was a model, a behavioral pattern, a system that had allowed bias to operate like standard procedure. And Rick, whether intentionally or not, had become the face that the public would no longer forgive. On Twitter, a user named @USConscience posted a single sentence, with no tags, no hashtags, no comments. The problem isn't what he said, it's that he believed he was allowed to say it. That tweet was shared 1,200,000 times within 24 hours, and the debate stopped. No one argued anymore that Rick just misspoke. No one said, "Let's wait for the official investigation." No one believed this was a personal matter, because an entire system, from internal radio chatter to shift room culture, had once tolerated statements like that being uttered in broad daylight without reaction, without warning, and worse, without being remembered. But the recording didn't forget. It wasn't bound by selective memory. It wasn't distorted by personal emotion. It wasn't censored by the department head. It had only one task: to play back, to repeat, to cut through the polished veneer of civility that institutions once used to plaster over wrongdoing. Rick, alone in a sealed room, after watching all the videos, finally listened to the recording, not through headphones, not from a compressed file, but through loudspeakers, played by the very person in charge of internal inspection. He didn't react. He didn't stand. He didn't argue. He didn't slam the table. He didn't shout, "That's not me," because he knew every reaction was meaningless if, in the beginning, he had believed he had the right to speak without accountability. And that is the most terrifying thing about a broken system. It doesn't raise monsters. It raises those who think they're harmless. Now, no one defends. No one is confused. No one gets to forget. As Rick's recording began triggering internal crisis management systems, Celeste's identity spread in the opposite direction. Not in silence, but in a simmering wave of respect, like a quiet referendum on honor, taking place among the circles of power Rick had never entered. The woman he had yanked a boarding pass from, handcuffed and interrogated as though she were a third-rate imposter, now appeared in a photo taken less than a year ago. That photo wasn't leaked by the press, but came from the official White House account, retweeted after 274 days of dormancy. Celeste Ruth Coleman shaking hands with the president at the signing of an Energy Security Act uniting the U.S. and the European bloc. The suit she wore that day, ash gray, round-necked, sharply tailored shoulders, was the same outfit she had on when Rick cuffed her at Gate 12. And that fact, unintentionally, turned the moment of Rick's public insult into a head-on collision between the old system and a dignity once positioned next to a presidential signature. On LinkedIn, a speech from 2021 was resurfaced, excerpted from Celeste's address at the Intergovernmental Conference on Fiscal History and Human Rights. In the 4-minute clip, she stood behind a glass podium, holding no papers, using no prompter, and spoke slowly, deeply. There are people in history who were handcuffed, not because they did wrong, but because someone else believed they didn't belong where they stood. Have we grown so used to handcuffs that we now think they are part of the security process? That question, spoken 4 years earlier, now landed like a precision strike against the very attitude of the system Rick once saw himself as the faithful embodiment of. A week after the incident, major European financial institutions, including Frankfurt Global, Bank Fraternelle, and Royal Capital UK, simultaneously issued short but decisive statements, sharing the same message. Should Mrs. Coleman resign or be reassigned due to the airport incident, we will reevaluate our prospective cooperation with the U.S. Department of the Budget. No grandiose language, no public campaigns. Just the subtle lift of a finger from entities capable of shaking economies with a single postponed signature. The Guardian called her the first woman to make global finance see the U.S. budget not just through technical lenses but through a moral one. Forbes published a piece by an Indian businesswoman who had met Celeste at a post-pandemic recovery forum. She wrote, "We had heard her speak. We had never seen her trampled. Now we have, and we admire her more. No one questioned why a person who once oversaw post-war aid networks flew without escort. No one wondered why she wore no insignia or diplomatic badge. Because now, that simplicity was no longer a cause for suspicion. It was the highest form of dignity, something people like Rick could not recognize. And Rick, the man who once believed he had the authority to decide who got to board a plane, turned out to be the last person in the country who didn't know who she was. In the employee holding room, he gripped his phone. After nearly a week without access to his radio and barred from all media contact, he was allowed a single phone call under legal aid protocol. He didn't call a lawyer, didn't call his wife, didn't call a union rep. He dialed his former superior, the one who had once sponsored his promotion to emergency patrol supervisor. His voice was hoarse. "Is she?" A silence followed, lasting the space of 3 steady breaths. Then the voice on the other end replied flatly, "The woman once nominated by the president to be Deputy Secretary General of NATO, but declined because she was still teaching global policy at a public university." He went quiet, asked nothing more, because even if he had, any answer would only make it clearer. Everyone, from embassy staff to interns fresh off their policy placements, knew exactly who she was. Only he, the man once in charge of an entire airport gate zone, had been the blindest cog in the entire system. As the media began to recast Celeste not as a typical victim but as a symbol of integrity, transcending racial labels, the articles no longer carried sighs, they became sirens. The New Yorker published an op-ed, "We've grown too used to asking who was the victim, and not enough what system bred the one who got it wrong." The Washington Post closed its editorial with an ice-cold line. Rick didn't know who she was, not because she hid it, but because he was never taught how to recognize someone who didn't need power to deserve respect. Celeste offered no statement to the press, gave no interviews, released no comment. But from her silence, it became clear she didn't need to justify herself because the very system that once trampled her now had to bow in apology. Rick, now reduced to a name buried in comment threads, a case study in the blindness of authority, no longer belonged to any rank. He wasn't even worth hating. He had become so small, he didn't need to be convicted. He just needed to be mentioned as a historical flaw the next generation would learn to avoid. And she, without walking taller or speaking louder, remained exactly where she belonged, not where scandal placed her, but where admiration naturally rose, a reverence that couldn't be granted, bought, requested, or revoked, because it never came from polish, only from presence. And for the first time, the world saw it, and for the last time, Rick realized he had stood on the wrong side, when Celeste Ruth Coleman's identity had already become a symbol, when public discourse, the media, and international financial institutions had all collectively shifted from outrage to reverence, Rick Hardwell sank into a prolonged silence, not because he was barred from speaking, but because he had run out of words. Every defense had become a farce, every reaction exposed as performative. And for the first time in over 2 decades in the aviation security industry, he had no one left to speak to. No institution came forward to support him. No union dared to raise a voice. And no one wanted to shake hands with a man who had just been redefined by an 8-minute video and a 27-second audio file. It was in that void that Rick did what those who've lost their power often do. He asked to meet, in private, the woman he had once demeaned, an attempt to claw back a shred of decency, not from remorse, but from the hope that Celeste's forgiveness could serve as a moral shield before the press. He asked his lawyer to send a letter, simple, polite, even bordering on pitiful. I wish to meet privately with Mrs. Coleman. I need to apologize to her directly for what I have done. Attached below was a bolded closing line. I do not ask for forgiveness, only to say aloud what I have come to understand late. That letter received no immediate reply. 3 days later, Mrs. Coleman's office issued an official response, delivered simultaneously to the editorial desks of 3 media outlets and the Federal Administrative Policy Oversight Committee. A short message, chillingly short. There is no private. This matter was never private. When harm is done in public view, when damage is inflicted before cameras, no one has the right to turn an apology into a discreet gesture to soothe their embarrassment. Mrs. Coleman declines. Full stop. Nothing more. That memo, though barely 3 paragraphs long, was shared widely across news platforms, becoming a moral slap for those still hoping the whole matter could be neatly tied up with a formal nod. Flowery words about moving toward reconciliation, internal resolutions, or quiet handling to protect institutional image were all crushed beneath a single principle Mrs. Coleman had never needed to shout for others to understand. If you do wrong in public, don't think you get to make it right in the dark. A day later, at the annual Interdisciplinary Ethics Governance Summit in Boston, Mrs. Coleman took the stage for the opening address. She didn't mention Rick, didn't name him, issued no accusations. But at the 13th minute of her speech, she paused, looked squarely at the audience, and said in a voice steady and unbendable, "An apology is not an act. It is an emptiness, unless followed by change." No one needed elaboration. Everyone understood. If an apology is wielded as a gesture to escape consequences, then it is no different from the cuffs that once locked her wrists. A reversal of power, disguised in the language of morality. Rick heard that speech from the HR office, where he was required to sit through a disciplinary hearing before being removed from the active security roster. At that moment, he decided to send a personal email, not through his lawyer, not via any official channel, but using the same email account he once used for patrol reports. In it, he wrote, "I hold no hatred. I just didn't know. I didn't think it was that serious. I'm sorry if my words or actions caused you harm. I'm not a bad man, just someone who was never taught right." The email was sent at 2:11 a.m. It would never receive a reply. 3 days later, during a press conference on the restructuring of TSA's internal misconduct response system, a reporter asked Mrs. Coleman's communications aide whether there were plans to respond to Rick's email. The aide, a white woman with blonde hair and a New Jersey accent, didn't say much. She simply placed a thin folder on the podium. Inside was a printed copy of Rick's apology email, original font, original line breaks, original punctuation. Then she pulled out a lighter, burned each page. The flames flickered in a stainless steel tray prepared for processed documents. When the last scrap turned to ash, she looked directly into the front row where the cameras were rolling and said firmly, without waiting for another question, "Not every apology deserves to be preserved." Then she stepped down from the podium. No glance back, no explanation, no room left for the man who once thought "I'm sorry" could be his ticket to reclaiming dignity after destroying someone else's. From that moment on, Rick knew he had no door left to knock on. No one believed he deserved a conversation. No one believed he was worthy of forgiveness. Not because people were cruel, but because, for the first time, society understood this. Not everyone who says "I was wrong" has ever understood what it means to have once been right. No one shouted in Rick's face anymore. No more tweets mentioned him with outrage. No protest signs, no hashtags, no sirens, no backlash. The storm had passed, not because he was forgiven, but because he no longer carried enough weight to be hated. People moved past him, the way they pass a dried smudge on a glass window. No need to wipe it. not worth the bother. And it was in that moment, when no one held a clear emotion for his existence, that Rick finally began to understand. Some deaths don't require breath to stop, only that society no longer finds a reason to speak your name. Following the internal investigation, Rick was officially terminated without reassignment. In the final line of the dismissal letter, the note read just 4 words: "Does not meet standards." No mention of discrimination, no serious misconduct, just a rounded phrase meant to avoid lawsuits, while silently cutting off any chance of return. He applied to a private security firm that provided guards for local fairs, the kind of job retired officers took as a last resort. But within 3 days, a rejection letter arrived, including a line from the legal department: "Ethical background does not meet service requirements." One old friend, the kind who used to drink with him after every patrol, called once and hung up after saying just one sentence that severed any chance of reconciliation: "Nobody wants you now, not even your enemies." Rick deleted all his social media accounts: Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, gone in a single night. He thought doing so might erase the stain, but no. Every time a new article on civil rights went live, his face still appeared in photo compilations titled "Profiles of Public Behavior Rejected by Society." Even after shaving his head, changing his glasses, trimming his beard, there was one thing he couldn't hide: that upright stance that once barked orders, that gaze that once swept crowds like every passerby was a suspect. And then, in a quiet afternoon at a suburban grocery store, while bending down to grab a pack of instant noodles from the bottom shelf, a child, no older than 10, pointed and shouted to his mother, "That's the man who got yelled at, right?" The mother pulled her child away without answering, but her eyes said everything: not surprise, confirmation. He didn't respond, didn't force a smile, said nothing, but the whole walk home from that store his hands trembled with every step, as if each footfall crushed a layer of that civil servant skin he used to wear like armor, now decayed, falling off in pieces. When he got home, the apartment was only half there. The other half, the one that once had the sound of a hairdryer, a spoon stirring tea, bare footsteps in the kitchen, was gone. His wife had said nothing before leaving, just left a folded piece of paper on the dining table. Slanted handwriting, sharp but even, the kind that doesn't invite follow-up questions. There were no accusations, just one short line: "I don't know who I've been living with." No punctuation, no name, just a blank white space, straight, cold, and final. Rick tried applying for a night guard job at a family diner, a place that once had a sign saying "Veterans Welcome." The application was initially accepted because the manager didn't notice the name, but within a day, after the outsourced HR firm ran a routine background check, the rejection came through. This time, there were no pleasantries, just a pre-printed form with the third box checked: "Do not hire former officers involved in racial scandals." Rick didn't protest, didn't call to appeal, didn't send clarifying texts, because he understood no one listens to a man who's no longer even worth disliking. People hate threats. People fear those who can still harm. But Rick was now just a faded silhouette. No influence, no voice, no place within any power structure or opposition movement. He wasn't left behind as a condemned man, but as an obsolete object, too familiar to shock, too disgraced to be forgiven, and too insignificant to still matter. No one hung his name on a courtroom wall. No one wrote op-eds demanding further punishment. No one marched, and no one begged leniency. And that absence, that vacuum, was the most painful declaration of all. No one wanted to hear him speak. No one needed him to repent. No one cared to witness his downfall, because when someone is no longer worth hating, it means they no longer belong to anything human. Rick was left behind, not by the sentence of a Supreme Court, but by the silence of a society that no longer felt the need to speak. And just as the name Rick Hardwell faded into a dusty moral relic, the name Celeste Coleman resurfaced, not as a celebrated victim, but as a moral reference point in the postmodern era, where justice resides not just in written statutes, but in how people remember a righteous act carried out amid prevailing wrong. No titles were bestowed upon her, no medals awarded, no statues cast, but none of that was necessary, because clearer signs had begun to emerge in the deeper layers of the community. Classrooms, textbooks, and sentences that didn't need to shout, yet shook the foundations of collective silence. At a public law school in Atlanta, a group of final-year students drafted a 12-page petition to the Academic Council, proposing the addition of a new lecture in the civil rights law curriculum. The proposed title, The Celeste Coleman Case, Silent Power, Subtle Bias, and Resistance Without Retaliation. In the petition's introduction, they wrote, "We've studied protest leaders, landmark rulings, and verdicts that overturned legislation, but we've never studied a woman who was handcuffed without bowing, without speaking, without striking back, and by doing so, forced an entire system into silence just to listen." The petition spread faster than expected. In less than 30 days, more than 27 law schools signed on in support, including major institutions like NYU, Berkeley, Yale, and Georgetown. A senior lecturer at UCLA Law said during a symposium, "This was a case that never needed a courtroom, yet still indicted an entire system." He said, nothing more. Because everyone understood, sometimes what deserves to be taught isn't the conclusion of a trial, but the process by which society is compelled to rewrite its definitions of right, wrong, and the ethical limits of public conduct. Celeste's name had never topped any political party. She held no social media accounts, signed no publishing deals, released no memoir, and had never accepted a spokesperson role for any advocacy group. Yet it was precisely her refusal of the spotlight that made one sentence she casually shared during a conversation with law students last year the most quoted line in the country. "I didn't win, I just didn't lose." That phrase appeared on posters, notebooks, laptop stickers, and graduation cards, not for commercial purposes, but as a quiet ethical reminder. Sometimes a person doesn't need to win. They only need to make sure that wrong doesn't survive too long. A high school student named Layla, just 17, chose Celeste as the subject of her essay for a national writing competition. In her piece, she wrote, "She didn't chant slogans. She didn't shout, 'I'm offended,' or 'I demand justice.' She just stood still, eyes unflinching, and walked as if the world needed to slow down a few steps to understand what had gone off course." The teacher grading the essay left only one note beside it: "No edits needed." This wasn't written to win. It was written to be read. And that was true. Layla's essay was read over 3 million times in a single week, after being republished by a local newspaper. No embellishment, no images, just lines of uninterrupted text, like the way Celeste had chosen to walk through the airport that day. And it didn't stop with education. In July, the U.S. Department of Justice issued a directive requiring all federally regulated airports to implement a new training program titled Subtle Bias and Silent Power. The course wasn't designed by outsiders, but by the very experts who had supported Celeste through the internal hearings, those who understood that modern racism no longer arrives with slaps, but with the ability to remain silent at the right moment, to avoid accountability. In the training manual, a line appeared in italics. "Power isn't wrong, but power that never asks if it's right always is." At the press conference announcing the training rollout, the DOJ spokesperson said only one line: "The incident at Gate 12 wasn't an accident. It was an indicator. No list needed." The ripple effect had already gained enough force to turn a single misstep into a reform blueprint. No one mentioned Rick. No one needed to, because the focus had shifted from an individual act to a communal wave, where the name Celeste Coleman was no longer just the name of a person, but the name of a principle, standing still in the right place at the right time, and forcing the world to stop and look. Ever since the student petition was approved and the subtle bias and silent power training became mandatory, the name Celeste Coleman no longer appeared only in policy briefs or media commentary. It began to filter into family conversations, high school civics lessons, and even end-of-day news segments, the kind of people who didn't need to watch from the beginning to understand that something was shifting. But Among all the things that now carried her name, from quotes to essays, training programs to internal policy revisions, nothing made people stop quite like walking past the newly renamed boarding area at Reagan National Airport. There was no official announcement, no ribbon cutting, no delegation, no ceremony, just a quiet Friday morning when passengers at Gate 12 looked up and saw new lettering on the sign, Celeste Passage, not Hall of Honor, not Memorial Wing, just one word. Passage, movement, not static, not framed, just like her, the woman who did not react as expected, did not scream in self-defense, did not demand tears, but by standing still at the right moment, had forced an entire system to change course. Just beneath the new name, a small digital display was mounted on the pillar between the two lanes leading into security screening. White letters on a deep blue background, no flare, no shine. It featured only one line of text, updated every 24 hours. And on the very first day, was the sentence Celeste had said on the day she was handcuffed. You don't need privilege to deserve respect. No one needed to explain it. No citation, no glass case, because words already etched into public consciousness need no protection. They live through recognition, not preservation. On the morning the sign changed, there was no ceremony, but 3 young black children, wearing elementary school uniforms, name tags, and holding a small bouquet of yellow chrysanthemums, walked with a middle-aged teacher from Concourse A to Concourse C. They weren't flying. They simply stopped at the Celeste Passage, at the very white line where Mrs. Coleman had once been stopped, and bowed to place the bouquet next to the iron post where a security camera had once captured her gaze. In handcuffs. No one cried. No one spoke loudly. One of the children whispered, "This is the place?" And the teacher nodded, squeezing their hand tightly. That alone was enough for a new generation to understand. The spot that once symbolized humiliation had become a symbol of dignity restored, without needing a stone wall or a bronze statue. An older woman, silver hair, wrinkled skin, eyes dark with the weight of too much witnessed, stood long in front of the passage's name. She didn't take a photo, didn't make a call, didn't record video. She just stood there, then leaned over, lowered her head, and whispered to her granddaughter, about 12 years old, standing beside her, "Now I can hold my head up walking through here." No one recorded the moment. It didn't go viral. It wasn't broadcast on television. But a man standing behind the TSA security line heard it and said it was the most meaningful sentence he had ever heard in 20 years of working at the airport. The press didn't swarm for headlines, but a few independent media outlets were present, not to interview, just to capture a single frame, the sign reading Celeste Passage above and 3 children bowing below, exactly where the center of a video that once shook a nation had been filmed. That photograph was later printed in a national newspaper with a caption that belonged to no PR campaign. There's no statue of Celeste because she didn't stand still like one. She moved forward. That sentence didn't need a famous writer. It needed no attribution, because everyone understood. Some people, if sculpted in stone, would only have their impact diminished. Statues are still. Celeste was not. She didn't need to remain fixed in one place to be remembered. She only needed to create enough change so that no one could ever return to how things were, as if nothing had happened. And now, the walkway once used to remove her from her seat bore her name as a quiet reminder. The world may not reverse overnight, but it can change direction if someone stands still long enough for the rest to realize they've been walking the wrong way. No one knew whether Celeste would accept the invitation. No one thought she had anything more to say. After everything they knew, from the incident at the airport, to her deliberate silence, to the student petition, to the quietly mounted Celeste Passage sign inside the National Airport, everyone assumed she had closed the chapter simply by not appearing. But then, a letter of confirmation was sent to Congress exactly 1 week before the hearing. Mrs. Coleman had agreed to speak once. No press, no tours, no questions, no personal remarks. Just a single statement. no longer than 3 minutes, before a special hearing on public conduct reform. That morning, the session opened earlier than usual. The gallery seats were full. Not a spot remained for journalists. Recording wires stretched across the chamber. Not because Celeste was a celebrity, but because she was someone who didn't need to be famous to make the entire executive apparatus pause and listen. The door opened. She entered. No entourage, no badge, no power suit, just a charcoal blouse buttoned to the collar, sleeves to the wrist. No jewelry, no insignia. No different than the way she had walked through Gate 12 over a year ago. No printed speech, no iPad, no notes, no prompter. She stood in the chamber, the same room where the nation's most consequential security laws had been debated, and waited for the last murmur to fade. It took exactly 8 seconds. Then she looked forward. Her voice wasn't loud, wasn't commanding, but it was uninterruptible. I don't want my children to have to wear suits, walk straight, and be polite just to prove they're not a threat. A silence fell like someone had vacuumed the air from the room. No applause, no throat clearing, not even the sound of keystrokes, because everyone who thought they could transcribe the speech had momentarily forgotten how to type, with their chest tightened. She said nothing else. She didn't need to. That sentence required no preamble. No explanation, no conclusion. It wasn't structured to persuade. It was a cut, a clean incision, dividing the world between those who live by privilege and those who have to wear it just to survive. The chief CPAN cameraman, who had filmed over 300 congressional speeches in 15 years, stepped out of the control booth after the session. He didn't say much, just turned to a colleague and whispered, "I've filmed hundreds. This is the only one." I didn't dare press record. When asked why, he just shook his head, because I was afraid the sound of the shutter would interrupt the one thing I'd waited my whole life to hear. The speech didn't headline the Washington Post, not because it wasn't printed, but because they didn't know what title to give it. It couldn't be framed as sensational because the line was too solemn. It couldn't be cast as rhetorical because it wasn't rallying. In the end, the paper published it as is, with no edits, no caption. I don't want my children to have to wear suits, walk straight, and be polite just to prove they're not a threat. That sentence appeared on the back covers of non-political magazines, in civics classrooms across Europe, on banners at education conferences in Canada, and it became the official motto of the Global Citizenship Initiative, an alliance of efforts combating implicit bias, behavioral discrimination, and the reconstruction of community leadership training. No one asked Celeste for permission, but she never objected. Because she understood, some sentences don't need copyright. They're etched into collective memory as a new lens through which society begins to define safety, trust, and human dignity. Meanwhile, the media began to revisit the Rick Hardwick case. A few legacy outlets tracked him down, now living in a neighboring state, jobless, silent. They wanted to ask what he thought of her words, but no one got an answer. Because no one cared about the answer anymore. No one quoted his name. No one wanted to know whether he still felt remorseful. His chapter had closed, not with a verdict, but with erasure from public memory. That sentence, with no opening, no crescendo, no introduction, kept spreading like a modern psalm, not to beg, not to protest, but to make the world confront how it once forced people like her to survive by doing no wrong, instead of allowing them to simply live as human beings. Rick was now a man who no longer bothered counting the days. He didn't mark the time that had passed since leaving the police department in silence. Time, to him, had become a faded circle with no starting point, no promise of an end. He lived like a faint scratch on the map, ignored by every direction, every signal, every collective awareness. The landlord didn't know his real name, just called him the old man in room 6, and neighbors, if they ever saw him taking out the trash, asked nothing. Once, on a gray Thursday afternoon, a child, chalk drawing on the sidewalk, looked up and blurted to his mother, "Mom, why does that man look like a criminal?" The comment wasn't scolded, wasn't corrected. It was brushed away with a hasty tug of the hand, leaving Rick frozen there, standing amid white chalk lines that hadn't yet faded. He didn't know if the child had seen his face on television or if his eyes simply could no longer hide the rot, he didn't dare think further. Some thoughts, once begun, cannot be returned from. The day Rick accidentally shattered a coffee mug at the diner down the street, the entire room went silent. No one yelled, no one cursed, but the air thickened as if someone had just exposed a long-buried truth. The server, a middle-aged woman with graying hair, silently picked up each shard of ceramic, replaced the cup for another table, then turned back to him and asked in a hollow voice, "Do you remember how many people had to clean up after you?" The question didn't ask for an answer. She didn't wait. But Rick couldn't finish another bite. He stood, left behind a crumpled bill and a coffee stain on the back of his shirt, soaked in some time without him noticing. He walked home, not because his car was broken, but because he had long feared sitting behind the wheel, afraid of steering anything when he no longer had direction. Rick had once believed he could start over. One early autumn afternoon, he went to a community center to apply as a volunteer, not to redeem himself, but because he feared forgetting how to speak to others. The coordinator, after glancing at his file, gave a faint smile and said, "We don't need anyone at the gates anymore, especially not someone who once locked others out with handcuffs." He wasn't accepted. But no one said it aloud. They simply closed the folder politely and walked into another room, leaving him standing in a long, cold hallway, like he'd never existed. Rick sat for nearly an hour outside in the parking lot before leaving. He never applied again. A week later, Rick opened a new social media account. No real name, no profile picture, just to observe a world he no longer belonged to. In a private group on judicial reform, he came across a comment. "He's not a man, he's a stain on history." The comment had hundreds of likes, and below it was a photo of him kneeling, not in remorse, but because he had been forced to during a disciplinary hearing years ago. A moment edited out of official broadcasts, but captured by a law student on their phone. No one knew who had reposted the image, but it spread like mold through the cracks of a decaying house. Rick deleted the account after 3 days, without comment, without reply, leaving no trace. But he saved the photo in an unnamed folder next to the familiar video he still watched. One winter night, the power went out in his building due to a faulty wire. He stepped into the hallway to ask for a flashlight, but the neighboring door never opened. As he descended the stairs, the only light came from the management office, where an old TV was broadcasting local news. The anchor was reporting on a new state law banning any police officer with a record of discriminatory conduct from working in law enforcement training program. Rick stood listening, unaware that the cold wind was seeping through the thin sleeves of his shirt. An elderly man, also a tenant, walked past, stared directly at him, and quietly said, "I once voted for men like you. Now I understand why the law needs to change." The old man didn't wait for a reaction, didn't explain. He walked on, pulling his coat collar tight, leaving Rick standing there like a period no one bothered to complete. He returned to his room as dawn neared. He didn't turn on the light, didn't start the heater. He just sat, staring at the crack running down the wall, like a story never told right. And then, as the first sliver of light slipped through the blinds, Rick turned on his computer. The screen booted slowly, as always. He didn't need the mouse, didn't need to type. Everything was already too familiar. The video appeared, paused at the 38th second, where Celeste looked directly at him. The light in her eyes didn't sear with pain, didn't blaze with rage, didn't boil with fury. It was a stillness that froze every noise inside him. He watched again and again, no skipping, no stopping, letting her gaze pierce through him like a mirror that refused to reflect, just a steady look, as if she had already known the exact moment his life would break and still chose not to interrupt. Every time he rewatched that moment, he stayed longer. Not to understand her, but to try to understand himself. Why, among the thousands he had interrogated, stopped, barked orders at, only one gaze had stayed with him. A gaze that never had to say, "You were wrong," because he saw that sentence in the mirror every morning afterward. He wrote a single line in his old patrol notebook, "I handcuffed someone whose eyes I never understood." No one knew what he wrote, no one read it, and no one needed to. because Rick Hardwell no longer had the reputation to be opposed, the credibility to be defended, the fear to be hated, or the relevance to be apologized to. He had been cut even from the role of a villain because society had realized some people don't need to be publicly disgraced. They do it to themselves better than anyone else ever could. He had once believed that all of it would pass, that after the media storm, after the news stopped replaying the footage of him handcuffing Celeste in the street, after the angry hashtags were replaced by newer, faster, fiercer trends, he would eventually be forgotten. But the truth is, some silences don't come to forgive, they come to erase, and nothing is colder than being erased by the memory of the crowd. Once he walked into a convenience store, and the young cashier, barely in his 20s, caught sight of Rick's name on his credit card and silently placed the receipt down on the counter, without a word. On the table lay his phone, playing a podcast titled Public Figures Who Don't Deserve to Be Remembered. Rick knew he'd just been added to that list, not by legal decision, not by verdict, but by the cruel quiet of everyday life. Once, he was standing at a bus stop in the rain. A car pulled up in front of him, the window rolled down, and inside were 3 teenagers. One spat out of the window, not hitting him, but close enough for him to understand this wasn't a prank. It was a reverse lesson from those once wrongly taught. They didn't need to know the case details, didn't need to understand the law. They just saw a face that once represented authority, now just a soaked shadow on the street. And they acted the way adults had taught them. The one who caused harm doesn't deserve to be heard. The next day, a short clip of the moment surfaced on a video-sharing platform with the caption, "When justice loses its badge, only a wet old man remains." It was shared hundreds of thousands of times. No one tagged his name. But everyone knew. Rick didn't report it, didn't file a complaint, didn't try to take it down. He simply saved the video in a folder named No Response Needed. Another day, as he stood in line at a public clinic, a young nurse, flipping through records while scrolling her phone, suddenly fell silent upon reading his name. She looked up, her eyes free of hatred, not threatening, just calm, like gazing at a memorial portrait that needed no candle. "Do you know? She can't play piano anymore." The question needed no subject, no context, no name, but Rick understood instantly. Those aged hands of Celeste had trembled the day he forced her against the police car amid the crowd's shouting, trembled from pain or fear or something else he had never asked. And now there was no one left to ask. The nurse didn't wait for a reply. She called the next name, as if that exchange had never happened, but Rick felt his entire body weighed down, as though that question had lodged in his lungs. He returned home, opened the video again, and rewound it to the frame where Celeste turned her head to look at him. Still that same gaze, not broken, not defensive, not needing to regain composure, a gaze that knew it was right and didn't need to explain itself to someone like him. He had once believed a single apology would be enough, but no one was waiting to hear it. Even the daughter he once believed would be his last tether to the world was no longer there. The last time he sent her an old music player, the one they used to listen to on camping trips, the package was returned. No note, no explanation. No reason, just a sealed box wrapped in thick tape, as if what was inside was a chunk of the past no one wanted to acknowledge. He opened it. The player was still there, battery leaking, unable to play a sound. He placed it in a drawer beside his notebook and the old badge that had once been pinned to his chest. No one asked why he kept them. He had no intention of throwing them out. Because for a man with no future, anything left, even if it no longer worked, was still evidence that something once did. But what he couldn't look away from in the video wasn't guilt or hope for redemption. It was because that frame was the only one he couldn't explain. Celeste wasn't angry, wasn't bitter, didn't try to respond, didn't shed tears. She simply looked, and it was that silence that choked him, because he knew when someone no longer bothers to be angry with you, it means they've left your orbit forever. One day, Rick took his old uniform out of the storage box behind the closet, the one that once let him walk into any room believing he was right. He put it on. It didn't fit. No longer hugged the shoulders, matched the chest. The fabric had faded, the insignia wore thin. But what kept him from buttoning it all the way wasn't the size. It was the sense that the fabric itself had wrinkled in the same way he used to grimace when someone resisted him. He tore it, not in anger, but to sever ties with the scent of power wrongly claimed. Yet even after tearing, the smell lingered, not in the cloth, but in his skin, under his nails, in the memory of every time he had once said, "There's no need to shout, ma'am, I'm just following protocol." And that smell, that power, unearned, self-assumed, clung like an invisible chemical no uniform removal could erase. No one came looking for him, no one called, no one needed to know whether he was alive or dead. And that was what finally made him realize, not because of pain, but because of the silence. Because sometimes the heaviest punishment is when no one thinks you're worth judging anymore. No trial needed, no sentence, just a single gaze and the rest of your life to live under it. I'm turned. Exactly 1 year after that fateful day, Celeste returned once more and stepped through the gate at gate 12, not as a passenger but as someone who had once been forced back, once humiliated under the indifference of loudspeakers, once handled by a system that acted as if it had never worn a human face. Today she came back not to recall what had been denied, but to walk through, quite literally, as a free person. There were no cheers, no one waiting with flowers or cameras, yet every pair of eyes in the terminal, from the woman at the ticket counter to the brown-skinned mother carrying her baby, instinctively stood up, not because they recognized her, but something in that walk, in the steady breath of someone who had once been silenced but never broken, made it impossible to remain seated. Her long cream-colored trench coat, unadorned, carrying no emblem, brushed lightly over the gray stone floor. Her footsteps didn't strike loudly, but they echoed. No one spoke a word, no music played, no usher led the way. The silence that surrounded her was the most powerful declaration of all. A white girl, around 8 years old, in a red and white striped dress, tugged her mother's hand and whispered, "I don't know who she is, but she feels right." And the mother didn't answer. Her throat, too, had tightened, witnessing a presence so starkly clear, not because of skin color or title, but because it made people look inward at themselves. As Celeste approached the security checkpoint, the guard man who once bowed to loud suits now simply nodded. No one asked her to present her ID. No one asked what class her ticket was. Every gaze waited, not for a command, but for a signal, as if this woman had already been validated by the very moment she was once denied. Pilot, middle-aged man with silvering hair and a solemn look, stepped out from the plane door, setting aside protocol, and walked straight toward her, extending his hand without hesitation. "An honor to serve you, this time the right way." The sentence was not dramatic, not rehearsed, but for those who remembered what had happened that year, it felt like something inside their lungs had been released. A deep, slow, quiet exhale. Celeste didn't shake his hand immediately. She looked into his eyes, not accusing, not scrutinizing, but as if asking, "Do you truly understand?" Then she took his hand, firm, decisive, without the residue of regret. Those nearby saw it, but no one raised their phones. Not because they didn't want to, but because they understood. Some moments are not meant to be recorded. They are to be kept not on screens, but in memory, in the deepest chambers of dignity. The plane bore no one's name, wasn't christened after any figure. Yet that day it was whispered across the terminal that this flight carried something higher than rank or title, a wordless acknowledgement, a silent lifting of truth. Celeste turned once more to look at gate 12. She didn't smile. She didn't burn with resentment. She just nodded, a subtle nod, the kind one gives to a past no longer worth resenting. She didn't forgive. She simply let go, because the weight of hate was not something she needed to carry on this flight. No one clapped when she stepped into the cabin, but the business class, usually bustling, fell into absolute stillness. A young man nodded at her as she passed. An older woman placed a hand over her heart without a word. The chief flight attendant approached and bowed slightly. "If you need anything at all, don't hesitate, Mrs. Celeste. No introduction necessary. No name tag needed. Her name was never announced, but everyone knew, not because she was famous, but because she had survived in a way the system could no longer deny. The plane lifted off the ground like any other, but everyone on board felt something had shifted. The air in the cabin was the same, but the atmosphere within each passenger had changed. No longer just business travelers or vacationers, each now carried a nameless thought, a feeling both light and quietly confronted, because they had just witnessed something the system often denies. A woman who did not demand justice, but made justice exist simply by continuing to walk forward. Celeste said nothing. The book in her hand lay open, but no one saw her read. Her gaze drifted out the window, where the clouds layered like unfinished sentences. In that silence, another language began to speak, the language of those who had been silenced and denied the right to resist, but never surrendered the right to exist. The plane landed in the afternoon. The door opened and sunlight poured into the cabin like a velvet curtain being slowly drawn. Celeste stood up, unhurried. Everyone waited for her to walk first. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood. As she passed the cockpit, the entire crew stood to greet her. No one raised a camera, no one posted an update. But that day, hundreds of people went home and told their spouses, their children, their friends. They had seen something that no viral clip could ever replicate. Celeste descended the steps, her coat catching the soft breeze. No one greeted her, but no one looked away. A young baggage handler ran past, then stopped abruptly, as if pulled by an invisible force. He bowed his head, unsure why. Perhaps he didn't need a reason. A woman like Celeste doesn't need to be fully understood, only seen with rightful reverence. As she walked through the arrivals hall, the security guards stood tall in unison, not by regulation, but by something more primal, an instinct that recognized someone who never bowed before humiliation. But before Celeste became a media icon, before her gaze became a symbol shown at international conferences, there had been a man who thought he had the right to assess her worth with handcuffs and sarcasm. Rick Hardwell, still wearing his name badge at the time, handcuffed her at the boarding gate, under suspicion of using a fake ticket, simply because she wore a suit and walked with a confidence that defied his bias against black women. A short video of her standing, forced into stillness in the middle of the walkway, her coat off-center, arms pulled behind her, not resisting, went viral. She stood motionless, like driftwood wedged in the flow of people. What made that clip different from every other scandal was the look she gave Rick when she turned back. Not anger, not weakness, not even pain, just a terrifying calmness from someone used to being insulted but never losing her posture. And that silence haunted Rick for months, until he couldn't bear it, tore off his badge, and disappeared from the force like a ghost out of favor. For over a year, Rick lived quietly in a southern suburb, avoiding crowds and reporters. But Celeste's silence never let him go, not through accusations, but through the way society quietly erased him, as if his name had never existed. When he attended a retired police conference, guests discreetly left the table. A Latina officer who had once worked with him returned her name tag when she learned he'd been invited to speak. "We don't toast with someone who made the entire force justify itself," she said, in front of dozens of former colleagues. A few weeks later, Rick tried to return to his old academy to teach an introductory training course. His application was rejected outright, with a single note, incompatible with the program's ethical values. The final blow came from where he least expected. His son was denied admission to a prestigious military school, not because of grades, but because his parent was linked to a federal human rights scandal. It was a phrase no one dared say aloud, but it echoed at every parent meeting where an empty seat sat beside Rick's name. Throughout that time, Celeste gave no interviews. She declined speaking engagements, wrote no memoir, and hosted no shows. She appeared only at closed congressional hearings, serving as a fiscal oversight advisor on global relief. Quiet, precise, leaving behind no slogans, only impact. It's said she helped block 3 misappropriated funding deals involving special interest groups and rewrote health budget allocations to ensure not a single dollar passed through nations known for racial discrimination in care. And when the Oversight Committee proposed honoring her in a formal ceremony, she declined with a single line, "I don't need my name carved in stone. I just don't want it used to excuse someone else's mistakes." That flight was her first public appearance in nearly 2 years. No promotion, no welcome sign, but everyone recognized her the moment she stepped off the plane. Strangely enough, among them was a newly assigned airport security officer, once an intern under Rick. When he saw Celeste, he removed his radio earpiece, stood still, and placed his right hand over his chest, not as part of protocol, but as an unspoken apology on behalf of the system. She didn't stop, she didn't nod, but her eyes passed over him, and that look alone made witnesses feel they had to live differently. That woman never asked for special treatment. She simply proved that what had happened to her should never happen to anyone else. Then she stopped, right in front of the glass door leading to the parking lot, door 12. It was no longer the system's gate 12, it was hers. A memory once meant to shame had become a reminder. Freedom is not a condition bestowed, but a posture maintained. She turned one final time, looked at the door. No smile, no tears, just a gaze, slow, deep and silent, like a verdict handed down without a judge. A verdict for a system that once believed it alone had the right to decide who was worthy of passing through. No one said a word. No one dared exhale. But everyone knew that moment didn't need recording. It had been etched into the one place no camera could reach, where people learn the difference between victory and transcendence. She stepped through the door, didn't look back, not because she despised the past, but because she had lived long enough to know some things aren't worth carrying, and some things, like the posture of freedom, are clearest when you walk forward without needing anyone to remind you that you were once stopped. No plaques needed, only silence, honored, and that final look was the closing line. If you've made it this far, it means something in this story has resonated with you. Maybe a moment of emotion, maybe a memory of your pain, or maybe something you can't yet name. Don't let that feeling fade. Leave a comment. Tell your story. Share your thoughts on fairness, dignity, or simply what this stirred in your heart. Every word you write isn't just your voice. It's a source of strength for us. Please, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so we can keep telling stories that are kind, powerful, and truly human. No moral lectures, just one reason for people to look at each other with eyes that know how to respect.